Good morning. Welcome back to our series on becoming His beloved, answering God's call to discipleship. What we're doing for you who have just joined these segments is we are beginning in Genesis, and we're at the end of Genesis now, and going through Scripture to Revelation, each time looking at what we can learn about becoming God's disciple and answering His call according to Jesus's great commandment and His commitment in Matthew, go into all the world and make disciples. Today we have come to the place where God has brought the Hebrews. Now, the Hebrews, the Jews, and the Israelites are all exactly the same people. It's interchangeable both in Scripture and in daily life. We hear that. They are a group of people who began with Abraham about the year 2000 BC, and then progressed through Isaac and Jacob. And Jacob's 12 sons are the original 12 tribes of Israel. And it's upon them that eventually the nation of Israel becomes founded. Now, they are brought, as we discussed last segment, by Joseph. And what happened was the Pharaoh elevated Joseph, who had been sold into slavery and ended up in Egypt. The Pharaoh discovered Joseph as a slave and elevated him to basically the second most powerful position in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh himself. Now think about that for a moment. A foreigner who was a slave is now second only to the Pharaoh. That power comes directly from God and is very, very instrumental in what is happening in God's plan. We're talking today about the 400 years that the Hebrews were in Egypt. All right, remember, when we were discussing Abraham, and God was talking directly to Abraham, Abraham told him that of his descendants, they would be like the sands of the beach, innumerable, so many, and that they would be a great nation. Also, he told him that they would, during this process of becoming a great nation, that they would go through a 400-year period. It's God telling Abraham this. They're going to go through a 400-year period in a foreign land. He didn't tell them Egypt, but he didn't tell him Egypt, but in a foreign land. So Abraham has two sons. Isaac is one of them. Isaac walks with God. The line goes through him. And he has two sons. Now we've got Abraham's grandson, Jacob. And Jacob finds himself, having been spoken to by his father and his grandfather, taught by them the ways of righteousness. Also, God has appeared to both Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and told them of His covenant and that their children would form a great nation. So imagine Jacob before we get to Egypt. He is sitting there in Canaan, And he, like his father, and perhaps a little bit like his grandfather, is looking all around and says, okay, here we are in the promised land. God promised it to us, but it's filled up with other people. And every one of them doesn't like us. And we're just a few people. So how are we going to take this promised land? Well, consider for a moment an interesting fact. Abraham had a couple of sons. Isaac had a couple of sons. Jacob, the Bible doesn't tell us this was Jacob's motive, but we can look back and draw our own conclusions. Jacob must have looked around and said, you know, the only way we're going to ever be able to possess this land is if we have a lot of children. So he ups and has 12 sons. Now that's a big departure from your immediate family traditions. Now, as I said, the Bible doesn't say that that's why, but I suspect that he was filled with puzzlement as he was going through his life as to how he was going to take part in this building of a great nation. And so he is there with 12 sons, and guess what happens? Remember, Joseph is over in Egypt. He's been missing for 20 years, and Jacob thinks he is dead. He's long ago given up that he'll ever see Joseph again. And all of a sudden, a famine hits the whole area of that part of the world. Remember that Egypt was the only one prepared for it because of Joseph interpreting the Pharaoh's dream that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And the reason Joseph rose to such heights with the Pharaoh was all of that came out exactly. And the Pharaoh couldn't think of a better person to put in charge of dealing with this than Joseph. So Joseph became basically the co-ruler of Egypt. But here sits Jacob with his family over in the promised land, what is now Israel, and it is struck with famine. They are starving. So he sends his sons to buy grain from Egypt because that's the only place you could get any. And out of all of that, as we discussed last segment, Jacob ends up going to Egypt, and with him all of the remaining members of his family. Now, God is revealing all through this process of his unfolding plan what he needs to, so that at least the person understands what is happening so far as they need to know. So in the 46th chapter of Genesis, at the 3rd and 4th verse, we have God speaking to Jacob. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. Now, what is the message that God is telling to Jacob? You are going to Egypt, but when the famine's over, don't leave. Don't try to bring your family back here. That would have messed everything up. He's giving him a heads up. You are going to die in Egypt. Putting Joseph's hand on his eyes means that when he died, his son would reach and close his eyes. So it was important, as Jacob was leaving the promised land, you can see he would have had a natural misunderstanding of God's overall plan had he not been spoken to that way, because he would have thought it was his main job to, okay, we need to go over there temporarily, but when it's all over, I need to get everybody back over here because this is the promised land that was promised to us. Well, God is letting them know, my plan is bigger than that. And his plan was bigger than that. So, God got everyone into the promised land, into Egypt, in a very convoluted and complicated way, as you can see. And here they are. They are in Egypt, and their job now, as has been revealed, is to grow into a great nation. And there we come to something that is amazing. Amazing historically and amazing even in Scripture. Joseph, who is very powerful, introduces his father and his brothers, his 11 brothers, to the Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, this is my family from Canaan. They are starving to death. They are shepherds. They have many, many sheep and other livestock. I would like for you to allow them to come here and live. And the Pharaoh thinks so much of Joseph that he says, all right, let's let them come here, and we are going to give them the area of Egypt in the Nile Delta, very fertile areas we'll talk about in a moment. He says, we're going to give them the land of Goshen. Goshen is in the northeast, in the southeast part of the Nile Delta, and it is prime crop and grazing land. The Nile Delta is the most prime agricultural and growing area in all of Egypt, and probably the most prime in all of Africa. And so the 70 people, there are 70 Hebrews at that time. So they've gone from 4 or 5 with Abraham, his grandson, we now have 70. They take up residence by order of the Pharaoh in the most productive and fine land in Egypt. Not only that, but it's also the area where the Pharaoh himself lives and the big supply cities that supply the city of the kings, Ramses. It is also right there. It's all mixed up together. Now, there are a lot of misapprehensions about the 400 years of the Hebrews being in Egypt. One of them was that they were promptly enslaved. Well, no, they were not enslaved until there were so many of them that a later Pharaoh said, wait a minute, we've got too many of these people. They're all around us. They're all around the city. They're all around this whole area. If they ever turned against us, we would be in big trouble. Some scholars estimate that probably was at least 200 years after Jacob for them to be perceived by a later Pharaoh as not just an advantage of people to help supply agricultural crops, but to be an actual danger to the Egyptian people. It was a stable country, though. Egypt was extremely stable because we had the Nile River feeding the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta is where it spreads out, and all of that land is regularly inundated by the Great Nile River. The Nile River starts essentially at Lake Victoria in Zambia and is, get ready for this, the Nile River is 4,132 feet long, and it flows from Lake Victoria through a river basin. And what a basin of a river is the sides that slope down to the river, where the topsoil during rains would wash down, as well as the water into that area. That river basin is comprised of 1,300,000 square miles. And then it comes to the Nile Delta, which is extremely fertile. Now, in that area of fertility is the city of Ramses and the city of Pithom. This is where all of this richness of all of this silt and all of this natural fertility comes down to. And this is where the Hebrews were developing and building their nation. God's plan is very, very clear to us in hindsight. God's plan has been developing in great detail. Look at what we've been talking about just today. God has taken Jacob, who thought he was in the promised land, and told him, you've got to develop further in order to get to the promised land. So now they are in Egypt. God's plan had to have included some careful planning, because this growth that had to take place in order for the Hebrews to claim God's promised land, many scholars have agreed could not have taken place hardly any other place than there. Imagine, we have them suddenly in not only the most developed of the civilizations and the peoples, the kingdom in the known world. We have them where they have 400 years of peace, although for at least 200 years of that they were under a bondage, a slavery, but they still weren't being slaughtered. They weren't constantly going to war. They weren't constantly having setbacks. They weren't constantly having great segments of them destroyed. God put them in the perfect greenhouse, if you will, in order to grow and thrive. Also, we have an interesting detail that is often missed. God has placed the Hebrews in a land unlike the current promised land at that point, which is entirely dominated by a people who, as Scripture says, believe that shepherds are abominable. In other words, the Egyptians weren't interested in assimilating the Hebrews. That would have been a disaster. So the Hebrews had been instilled with the idea that God wanted them to be a tight-knit, family-oriented community of faith people. They also wanted not to be assimilated. They were being taught by their families and their leaders about God's plan for them to develop to eventually claim the promised land. They all knew that. So we have just an unbelievably ideal situation that could not have been recreated anywhere else. It's time for the Hebrews to develop. It's time for them to grow into a great nation so that they can claim the promised land. It is time for them to do all of these things, and God has provided for them the most ideal environment in order to grow into exactly that. What we've got here is an amazing thing for us to consider in our individual searches for discipleship. What we have is that in Scripture, as well as in our own lives, we can see that God develops patterns and plans from which we can perceive, as these greats that we have been discussing, can perceive where our place is in the plan that God has. We have a situation where we have 70 people that were the people of Israel when Jacob was alive, who over the course of 400 years developed into, the Bible tells us, 630,000 people. What we have is a wondrous, wondrous thing. We have God's spiritual plan, that is a dot in the pattern, that begins with Abraham and the Old Testament covenant. Obey me, follow me, obey me, do what I tell you, follow my commandments, and you will thrive and prosper. I will bless you. That's the Old Testament covenant. And then we have God developing that into the covenant becoming where they are about to be able to claim their promised land. So we have the spiritual aspect of this infusing these people from the very beginning with Abraham. Now what we have is the growing into hundreds of thousands of people of faith in Egypt. We have the substance of God's plan and His promise in the growing of all of these people. You have heard it doubtless many times said, God works in mysterious ways His wonders to perform. And here we have seen how complicated and how many mysterious steps it might take for His plans and His promises to mature, not only in the life of the thriving of the Hebrew people into a great people to form the foundation of what ultimately would become our church of 2.5 billion people. But you can see these patterns if you look and watch and trust in your own life. Thank you. Have a nice day.